Is these are typically Velcroed into the cabinet under the TV, and these are your color charts. The one that has the grid of each color is your transparent, and the reason it has the grid is it's going to be different depending on what color metal you put it on, or if you have it on top of a white or a see-through base, which kind of primes the color. And you'll want to test your colors. You'll want to test your colors when you are testing them out before your final project, just so you know what they're going to look like. And I'll show you how to do the primer and everything. Whereas the opaque colors are going to be the same no matter what. They're not see-through. They're super reliable. I like using the transparents as a filter almost on top of an opaque if I can't find a color. So if I wanted to like tint this green just slightly more blue, I could take a transparent blue and put it on top of this. And you can fire your enamel as many times as you need, so it doesn't need to be like X amount of firings and then it's done. And then in the cabinet, we have the little jars that have the labels like I was pointing out yesterday. We have the junk drawer section where they're just numbers. This is the decoding sheet for the numbers, or you could just find it on the color chart. Or if you're feeling really lazy, just do a little tester on scrap and test it out. When you are enameling, stay away from nickel. If you feel really strongly about nickel, you're gonna have a lot harder time. And if you're okay taking on that challenge, I won't stop you, but I will tell you, brass and copper are gonna be the best options for you. And I just punched out circles for this. As you guys are testing color, do me a favor, don't take any of our like super nice, high quality, unscratched metal. Take from my recycling drawers that I have on the shelf behind my desk, and that way we're not wasting any really good metal that we're planning on just throwing away anyway. And then when I start this, I'm gonna show you how to do the base colors. And your two base options are a white and a clear, and these are basically just gonna prime your color if you have a transparent, so they're a little bit brighter and it's not the color of your metal shining through. If you're doing opaques, you don't even have to do these. It's totally only if you're doing the transparents that you need that. And when you are working, you're gonna sift it on a grid like this. And we don't have enough for everybody to use, but we do have a bunch of these fireproof fabric pieces that you can work on and then fire it on the grid. And I'll show you loading this so it's easy for you to load on the grid. Don't try to fire just the fabric on its own. And when you are working with enamels, you're sifting them on kind of like powdered sugar. Wear a mask, make sure you're wearing it, because when you're doing it, we're all doing it. So I wanna make sure we're not breathing in that dust when you're working with it. So I have a white and I have a clear. These are like my primers, since I'm gonna show you with the transparents. And how I go about doing this is enamel's pretty pricey, so I'm gonna put the lid underneath. A lot of you in level 1, I taught you to put a piece of paper underneath. Anything that helps you to catch it and put it back in the bottle when you're done. And then in this container, this is normally in the cabinet under the TV also. These are how I sift it on. So I've got different sizes. Some of these are like teeny tiny detail guys, but they're just basically like sifting on powdered sugar. So let me grab one. And ideally, be really careful not to mix things into the enamel. And if you see like in a communal studio, there's like chunks of black, work around those or try to scoop them out. But they will show up as a different color in yours, so try to avoid that. And then I'm gonna use my little note Post-it to cover up half of this. And I'm gonna sift it over my lid just by shaking this on. If my metal has any oil, like from my hands, if it was a new piece and it's got oil because it was shipped with the polish layer, clean it off with dish soap. And that way your enamel will be able to really sit and connect to your metal, because oil tends to block that connection. And all I need is one layer covering up my metal. I wanna make sure that it's not mounded up super thick, because it's more likely to be bumpy and crack if I leave it really heavy. And I've got my, I think I had the clear, oh, this was the white on that side. And then I'm gonna do the clear on the other side. If I forgot to put that tray underneath and I mixed multiple, then you just gotta toss it. But these bottles are pretty expensive, so take the time to try to preserve as much as you can of this. And then this will be my clear. And I would sift this on. I usually like to do each layer, fire it, and then I'm not working with so much fragile powder that's gonna fall around and spill off my piece as I walk it over to the jewelry kiln. And if you fire it and you see that one layer is like a little thin, you can patch it and then keep going. Like I said, you guys can fire this as many times as you want. And then when this is done, that little piece of paper is kind of an easy, quick way to mask it. I've also seen people do stencils for that, or like put like a little leaf there as a resist and then sift it on. But when I fire this, this is basically what I already have. So white on one side, clear on the other. Like I said, if you're doing the opaques, you don't need to do this, but if you're doing the transparents, these will be your primers. And then I want to show you all how to fire this, but so we're not going back and forth, I'm going to do a couple colors right on top of here. I don't know that I would recommend doing it this way where they're all fresh. And I just picked 2 randos that had a lot. So I'm not saying that this is the color palette of the week because I have a see-through blue and a bright orange. So I'm going to do kind of an ombre effect, which is pretty easy because all I'm doing is I'm tapping more in the areas where I want my color to be denser. And then I'm going a little bit less in the areas where I want it to fade. And that'll probably be a bit thin. Since it's a tester, I'm not too worried about it. If this was my real one, I'd probably end up going back into it later and adding a bit more. And then I'm gonna do some orange on the other side. The blue that I just put on is a transparent one, it's see-through. This orange is opaque. So you'll see how it doesn't honestly matter too much what your base is when you fire that. And when you are trying to play with your colors, you have the option of blocking off areas and masking like I did with my Post-it. You have the option of sifting and fading. I've even seen people take a little bit of 2 colors, mix it together in a dry water cup, and then enamel that together, and they get kind of a 2-tone. But if you do mix it, make sure you're doing it minimally so we're not losing much. And when I fire this, I'm gonna put it in our jewelry kiln, and it's gonna go in for 1.5 minutes. The main thing with the jewelry kiln is any fabric that touches what comes out of that kiln is instantly going to ignite. So if you have baggy sleeves like I wore today, push them up out of the way. If you've got long hair, pull it back, because even if you take this out and you lean over it and you have long hair, if your hair touches that, it is going to immediately catch fire. So make sure you guys are really, really careful with it, and I can be there with you as you're doing it if you're nervous. But I'm gonna carry this dude over, I'm gonna put him in the kiln for 1 minute. If I needed any holes drilled in this, I would have needed to do it before I enameled, because the minute I try to put that dent in, it's gonna shatter what's on the surface. So I wanna make sure I drill it ahead of time. And if I'm sifting my enamel on and I clog that hole, I've got a needle tool back by the kiln that you can kind of poke through to reopen the hole, because the glass may fill the hole if you really pack it in there and it clogs it up. Kiln is back here. We also have the acid etching bath back here, so just stay away from that area and try to make sure you don't put anything hot by the cords. And when you're working back here, I've got tape on the counter that reminds you what the kiln temperature should be and what the firing time is. Your kiln temp should be at 1,450 degrees. If we're all opening and closing this during class, it's probably gonna lose temperature. So you may just see that you have to fire things a little longer and kind of get a feel for like what it looks like when it's properly melted. So I'll show you guys some examples. And then if you're working with thicker or thinner metal, you may have to customize your firing time just because your metal will heat up slightly different rates. So if you're seeing that even with 1.5 minutes, it's still under fired, you can just bump it up a little longer if you need. And I have this, I think this is actually just a hot dog skewer. That is a perfect spatula for our kiln. I slide it under my tray. So I've got my tray kind of held up, sorry, see, kind of like this. And then my kiln, when I open it, is a blast of red hot heat. If you're nervous about this, I have gloves under here that you can wear so you don't have to have your bare hands by it. And then I also have all these trays and those little fireproof fabric pieces down there as well. If they're cool, put them back down there. If they're hot, put them on the counter towards the back so nobody bumps them. And then I'm gonna put this in. I've got 2 shelves, you can use either one. When you are firing these, there is a water over here and some tweezers. When it comes out, you can quench it, which is what it's called if you put it in the water to rapidly cool it. Some of the enamels will crack off when you do that. So that's why I would highly recommend testers. The gentler way to cool them is just to let them slow cool, but the quenching makes it faster and more convenient for you. So that's optional if you want to use it. And then as you work with bigger pieces, like what Arden has, I have these old irons back here, and sometimes with the heat, your piece will warp. When you take it out, if you're noticing it warping, I've got tweezers right back here. Take it off your tray, put it on the counter, counter is fireproof, and then set this on top of it to flatten it out while it's still hot. But my timer just went off, so I'm gonna get this dude out. So when it comes out, it's gonna be like red hot. And when it's red hot, my colors are usually a fair amount darker. So right now my orange looks kind of red. I'm gonna let this sit usually when I quench it for like 10 seconds or so, and then I quench it. But I will show you guys, when I quench it, it's gonna hiss. Totally normal, it's just readjusting. And then I don't know if you can see the difference already of as soon as it cooled down, my orange is really bright and not so red anymore. This is the side where I had the flux. This is the side where I had the white. You can see that base color coming through in the gaps of my color, whereas on the blue, it's a little bit brighter on the white, a little bit more dim on the clear. So that's why the benefit of testing is kind of helpful to figure out what layering you want. I forgot to mention this, but as you're firing, you can kind of see the black on the edges here. I'll put on our Schoology a visual guide for you guys of the melting phases of enamel. What you're going for is a smooth layer of glass. If it still looks like sugary grain, it's not melted enough. And if it looks dimpled, kind of like an orange peel, it's halfway melted. And if it starts to burn off at the edges like mine is, then it could go in for a little less time. So I could patch this color, put it back in for less time, and then I would just have to figure out that firing timeline for mine. This is a pretty thin piece of metal, so I think it just burned a little bit faster. So I wanted to show you guys, the back right now is just oxidized, so she's real gnarly. If you want to leave the back bare metal, we can just keep firing, keep doing the whole process, and at the very end, we'll sand this and clean it off using the flex shaft. But if you want this to be fired on both sides with enamel, I have these in the cabinet under the kiln, these little trivets. And this serves for you to flip your piece upside down, and that way your glass enamel isn't touching the screen, so it melts into that during the firing. The only thing I don't like about this is called counter enameling when you enamel the back, is the rest of the time you fire it, you have to have it on one of these trivets, and it's just a lot harder to carry around. So you can choose to do the counter enamel on the back or skip it. It's totally up to you. And then, but with the wire for Cloissone, this is a finished little tester that I did with Cloissone, and my wire is stuck in there now. So I'm gonna just play around with some rando wire that I pulled over. When you all are doing your Cloissone, what I would recommend is I would do either one of our base colors of the white or the clear, or I would do your background color, and I would fire that on like what I have now, and then I would shape your wire and nest it on top of that, and then we can fire it again. Some people prefer to do it all in the fresh powder, but the reason I don't like that is I feel like I end up knocking all the powder around and it's a lot harder to do. So I prefer to have my first layer fired on first. And then when it comes to your wire choice, same thing, avoid nickel, make sure you're using copper or brass. And then when you are picking your wire, you're ultimately going to be building up your enamel to the height of your wire. So if you go super thin, you don't have the ability to build your enamel up very thick, which might be more prone to chipping off. So I would pick a wire, I think this wire is like 18 gauge. I wouldn't go any thicker than like a 16 or a 14, and I wouldn't go any thinner than a 20. So if you're not sure, I'm happy to help. But what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna play around with some round nose pliers. I'm just gonna do a little spiral shape. You guys are gonna have more intricate wire work because you're gonna be doing your sections. Be considerate of the plier shape that you need. Round is gonna give you more rounded edges, whereas your flat nose pliers are gonna give you more kind of crisp bends in it. And then I'm doing this so speedy for this demo, but for you, I would even sand the bottom of your wire. I would rinse it with dish soap like you did for your metal. And then I even usually will take it on the steel block or the granite block and hammer it so I can guarantee that it's sitting flat, because I want to make sure that this is nice and flush against my piece. I want to be kind of lazy and show you what happens if it's not. The downside is that's easy to snag, and then when it does pull up, it might pull off my enamel too, so it could backfire on me. And then I am just gonna cover this with a little bit more orange. My background is the tester, so she's kind of wild. At this point, you would have your background color and you would just take whatever that is, sift a little bit more of that color on. If it gets on your wire, it's not the end of the world, because what you can do is you can dust it off with a paintbrush, or at the very end, I'm gonna show you guys how to sand it, and then you can clean off your wire again. but make sure it's sitting flat. Mine has that kind of bend up in a few spots, and that's gonna give me some problems and wanna fall off, I bet. But I am going to sift this on. Make sure that it's a little bit thicker by my wire because that'll help hold it down. And then I'm gonna fire this again. It always goes in for 1.5 minutes. But what we're gonna do with the Cloissone is a way to paint it on called wet packing. And when you do that, you can use a water cup or even just a lid that I have under the sink, but I just grabbed one of our paint palettes. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna work with my transparent blue just because that's what I have here. And knowing that these are kind of expensive, I'm gonna try to use a pretty small amount just since I'm planning on doing this only as a tester. And when I wet pack, I want everything to be really clean. I don't want any acrylic or glaze left in here. And then I've got a little bit of water, and all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get some water into, I might actually pour a little bit. I might regret this. I'll see how much I can get without just drenching this. But what I wanna get this to the consistency of is like when you build a sand castle, that like wet, like if you think about it, you're wet packing sand together to build a sand castle. That's what I want, is I want it packable, not so runny. If it's runny, like what I just did, you could add more enamel to it, but the downside of it being super watery like this is the granules of my enamel are gonna be more spread out on my surface and harder to see. So it's like a thinner coat. I've seen some artists do this on purpose where they create kind of like a shadow or a wash effect with it by working with it kind of wet, but I want mine a bit more packable, which she's still a little too wet. This is the down. And then when you're wet packing, since the dust is trapped in the water, you don't have to wear a mask. But if somebody next to you is sifting and you want to be super health conscious, I still would. And then now I've got this kind of clumped up on my brush, and what I can do is I can go through, and my wire serves as walls, and I can start to pack in color in certain areas where I want it. I just did a loose spiral, so I don't necessarily have sections. If you have sections, it'll work nicely to trap your color where you want it. And you can see how mine's kind of, you might not see it, but I bet the video might see it. Mine's seeping under the wire since my wire's a little bit lifted. That's why I want my wire to make sure it's flat, so it's a true barrier. And then this would go in another 1.5 minutes. I could add whatever colors I want. I could fire this first and then add the others if I prefer. But the only thing with wet packing that's a little different is I need this to dry before I fire it. If I fire it wet, it boils, and then I get all these little negative space areas in it from it bubbling up, and then I have to go back and refill them. So what I usually do is I let this sit for a little bit. I press it down to really make sure that my enamel sand is packed together. Then I fire it for 1.5 minutes, and then I just keep doing this as many layers and as many times as I need. But at the very end, we want to make sure that your height of your enamel is level with the height of your wire. And then I have tools that we can sand down your wire with, so if any enamel gets on it, it's not a huge deal.